Hi, everyone. And welcome to week 3 of my Fallish writing series. We have 2 weeks down and still so far to go. But it's going to happen, and we're going to do it together. So, as I stated, we are on week 3, which is currently the character development portion of this fall-ish schedule. I don't know why every single time I try to say it, it never sort of comes out correctly. But currently, we are on week 3. And as a PSA, we are going to sort of cover week 3 and week 4 in this live. Now, you are not required to stay for week 4 if you just want to do it week by week. I have a last minute schedule change for next week. I will be on travel for my day job. And so because of that, I will not be here to be with you guys. But to make up for that, I'm giving you week 3 and week 4 together today. And I will restream this session next week as well. So that way, if you want to come back next week for week 4, you definitely can, because this will be there streaming for all of you. Because I think this is very important to stay consistent and to stay on track when it comes to writing. You have to make sure it stays in your schedule. So let's do a quick recap before we move forward. Week 1 was our introduction to this series and goal setting. And in week 1, you were supposed to choose your genre, your theme of your story, set attainable goals, and I gave you some tips to stay motivated. You also had homework, a 1-page summary. I hope you did it. Week 2, we talked about plot and story structure. Your story needs structure, and plot technically is like the bones of the story. They keep you standing up. And then we talked about your pacing. Is it a slow progression or is it a fast-paced story? And you also had homework. And when it was to complete an outline. Did you complete their outline? I did. Now, my outline is rough. It's in my remarkable tablet. But my outline, not gonna lie, is super rough. Very rough. Like, I don't need anyone looking at this very rough draft plot outline because it's just the bare bones. And that takes us into week 3. Character development. Because if your plot is your bones, the structure, the beams that hold the story together, that hold the story up, it is all the action, everything that sort of pushes the story forward. If the plot is your bones, your characters are your nervous system. They make your readers care. They make your readers feel something. And so we need to give your characters the time and attention they need so your readers can connect with them, love them, hate them, want to be them, want to get rid of them, and anything in between. So let's talk about character development. In this session, we're going to focus on strong characters, your character's profile, your arcs of your characters, and then ways to bring your characters to life. And there will be time for questions if you have any. Just go ahead and drop them in the chat. And then there will be homework as well. Now, unlike this past 2 weeks where your homework was due the following week, you guys will have 2 weeks to complete your homework. But you'll have 2 weeks worth of homework to do. And I also will have 2 weeks to complete my homework. But I think giving you guys a couple extra time to sort of merge all the homework together, because when you finish, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But when you finish the homework from these 3 weeks, you're eventually going to sort of merge them together to one big thing that sort of helps push the story along. So, without further ado, let's get in to week 3. Strong characters. I updated my PowerPoint, people. Strong characters. Strong characters drive your story. They do. You either love them, you hate them. I can't tell you how many times I have gone to conventions and I've seen people just dress up as characters that they resonated with before they even came out on TV. Um, there are people who cosplay as characters for books that have never been made to a TV show, that have never been made into a movie. That the only reason people sort of know what they look like is because of fan art that people get from just reading and connecting with those characters so much. Um, Characters drive your story. Your readers want to connect with the people that they're supposed to care about in these stories. And if they can't care about them, what is their investment in being in this and reading your book? You don't want people to do not finish your book because of your character. Are your characters relatable? Um, that's another thing. If you're writing a book for people to relate to your main character or a character in there, are they relatable? Are you writing for your readers or are you writing for a different set of people? And are they complex? Now, these three questions are questions that help build strong characters. Um, Now, complex means different things to different people. So remember, when you're answering that question, you're answering it for the people you want to read your story. Would the people who you want to enjoy this story find your characters complex in a good way? Because you don't want it to be a character where you're just like, I don't really get them. Like, they're very complex. There's a sci-fi book series that I love, and I can't really connect to the main guy because he is this super smart genius who just like, even in the book he speaks in science. He speaks in science, and while as a sci-fi book that's a very space-driven story, that makes sense for him. And while the story is why the reason I'm staying along, I really don't connect with that main character because he is a little too complex for me in how he does things. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing because I still read the story. I don't want to throw the author's name out there because I don't want it to be misconstrued that I dislike the story or not, because I don't. It's still the idea of the story still compels me and keeps me going. But it's really hard to care about the main character because I don't really see him as an equal, as someone I can relate to or hang out with. But that doesn't necessarily that doesn't necessarily mean he's not a strong character. Because his counterpart is someone I do connect with. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking of your strong characters. Is your story character driven by this one main character? Um, your readers going to engage with them on a deeper level? Um, can your readers relate to the main characters or one of the main characters? If not one, if you have like more than one main character, can your readers relate to one or two of them? Um, and then, are they complex? Are they complex? Profiles. There are three things. Now, it's not the only three things that you need to think about when you're making character profiles, but they are some of the things you want to think about when creating your character profiles: the backstories, their traits, and their relationships. Now, backstories are probably one of my favorite things to write. Backstories don't necessarily always make it into the book, but they make the character who they are. So, for example, for Amatrice Magic, Olivia London was raised in the foster care system. You never see any part of that in the book. There's a lot about her backstory that I created that's in notebook that fills pages of notebooks that made her the way that she is, that made her who she is in the first book of Amatrice Magic, of why she sort of doesn't fight back, of why she sort of accepts the way life is. It was the way that she was raised. These are all backstories that I have for her, but that doesn't necessarily make it into the book, but it makes Olivia who she is. And if I didn't have her history shaping how she reacted to the future, Amatrice Magic could be very different. If Olivia didn't grow up in the foster care system, if Olivia believed that she was in a coven, if she was adopted by a family in a coven and grew up in a loving household with two parents, Amatrice Magic could be very different in how Olivia was willing to search into her family's history if her upbringing did not warrant it. So her backstory shaped who she was. Even though everything wasn't shared with the readers, I knew her backstory and it helped me create her. What are the traits? What are the personality traits of your main characters? And even like the people that are around them. What are their weaknesses, their fears? What makes them a well-rounded character? What are some desires that they may have? Is it something that the readers can connect with? Or is it something that you're just have or you never thought about for your main character? You want to make them human. You don't want to make them to where you don't want to make them where they don't have any weaknesses, any flaws. You want them to be more human. So what are their desires? What are their fears? What are their flaws? What are their strengths? What are the attributes that they have? Keep that in mind. And relationships. How do they interact with each other? How Olivia and Arte interact, it wasn't by accident. She's a little standoffish because she doesn't fully trust him. Why? Because of her history, her backstory, and some of his traits. She doesn't like it. But how she interacts with Desson, someone who's proven to Olivia that she's a good friend, someone who's been there for her when all through the ups and downs. How she interacts with Clive, how she interacts with Mrs. Coe. All of those are different relationships that she has, and she interacts with them slightly different. How she interacts with the people from the law firm where she worked versus the people who come into the store, Wicca. All of those are relationships, and every single one of them is a thought of how she's going to react with them. Is she going to be nice? Is she going to be standoffish? Is she going to be sure of herself and secure, or is she going to hide into who she is and just sort of fade into the background because of her standing in their community? These are all things you have to think about when you're creating your characters. How their relationships interact with each other, what are their traits and their backstories, because that makes your character who they are. They're the three little building blocks of your nervous system. They're not the only things that go into your profiles. Age and all this other stuff does as well. But I wanted to give you guys some easy bite-sized versions. Examples. Going into character arcs. Your arc, for the most part, most stories have arcs. There are some characters who don't go through any type of arcs. They start off as a good person, they end as a good person. They start off as a villain, they end as a villain. And then you have the ones that go through a positive arc or a negative arc. Those are the most fun. In my opinion, seeing a good person go bad is always a little fun. But what is the arc that your character is going to experience in this book? Are they starting off naive and thinking the world is made of sunshine and rainbows? And by the end of the book, they are aware of the evils that live in this world? Are they someone who believes the world is only evil and they bite back at every hand that tries to feed them? They push everyone away. And at the end of the book, they believe and hope and they have fun and they become the bubbly person. And in so many crossways, and are they a superhero who believes that they're doing the right thing? And turns out every time they save someone, they've been killing so many other people. And now they don't know how to view themselves. What type of arc is your character going through in this story? For Amatry's Magic, Olivia is going through sort of a knowledge arc. Her character is growing and learning and understanding about herself. She thinks she knows herself at the beginning of the book, but she doesn't. And so she's going through a knowledge and a growth arc. And that is sort of what I've been trying to showcase in book 1 and book 2 is her growth. I hope I'm doing a good job at it. But what are some story arcs? What are some character arcs that you are trying to do for your characters? Is everyone having a positive? Is while someone going up, someone's going down? Or you have some characters that just don't go through anything? So think about that as you're creating your characters, the arcs that you want them, because the arcs that you want them to experience, because that shapes your plot as well. Because if certain action items have to happen for your character arc to go up or down, you need to make sure you know what you want them to experience so you can write it into the story as well. Because the one thing that you hate to see is when you get to the end of the book and everything is sunshine and rainbows, or everything's fixed and solved, and you're just like, whoa, 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 whoa. That character didn't go through anything that made them see anything differently. This makes no sense, and you don't want them to do that. So, know your arcs. And then talk to a friend, to a trusted guide, a trusted person in your writing life, and ask them, is this compelling? Is this a good arc? You need to have a friend who's willing to tell you, don't do this. Now, you got to know how to distinguish, is it going to be a good friend or a bad friend? But you need to have someone in your life who's going to tell you, look, you need to push this person a bit more. You got to give them a little bit more heartbreak before they can understand what they're going through. Or you got to give them a little bit more time to see the good in people before they automatically flip the switch. So you need to know, is it a compelling arc? And sometimes when we know and love our character so much, and trust me, I know and love my character. I love me some Olivia. But the first iteration of her was someone who was never going to go through a positive arc or a knowledge arc or anything, because the way I wrote her, it just sort of was instantaneous. And no, that didn't work. I was told very kindly by a friend, go back to the drawing board with her. And so I did. So make sure you know your arcs. Bringing your characters to life. You're going to hear this line a lot in life when it comes to writing. Show, don't tell. Don't tell them you're a bubbly person. Show them you're a bubbly person. Don't tell them, oh, they don't smile. Explain why they're not smiling. Show your readers your character's traits. Show them through their dialogue. Show them through your writing. Don't just tell them what you want them to know about your character. Show them. Find your voice. I'm looking at my notes. Sorry. Find your character's voice, because every character should have sort of a slightly different voice. They all shouldn't sound like the same person. They all shouldn't be able to put on a mask and no one can tell them apart. You want them to have their voice, and make sure the way that they speak, the way that the slang that they use is unique to each character. If you have a character who's from New York, they're not going to talk the same way as someone who was raised in California. And so you need to keep that clear. If it's a prominent point to your story. American slang, if your main character is from a different country, they're not going to speak in American slang and vernacular. They're going to speak in a different way. And so you want to make sure that your characters are staying true to how they would speak from wherever they are from, if you are giving them prominent speaking roles in your book. And as I stated earlier, they need to have some prominent flaws and strengths. You need to know you can't just make someone who is just a perfect person. No, we have learned through so many medias that perfect people are not perfect people. There's always a problem with them. Always a problem with perfect people. Find the problem. No one wants to read someone who can do no wrong. Real people make mistakes. So, we've come to the end of week 3's information. I know I sort of went through it a little bit too fast because I need to also talk to you guys about week 4. So if you have any questions about week 3, just go ahead and let me know. And your homework for week 3 is complete character profiles for your main characters. And again, you have 2 weeks to do this. You have 2 weeks to do this, technically. 1 week if you want to stay on track. But complete your character profiles, write about them, and then write a prominent character scene or a character-driven scene. But when you write your profiles, these characters should be your friends. You should know them. Write their profiles like you're their friend. How would you describe them? What is their history? What is their backstory? Did they have a good childhood? Did they not? Does that shape how does their childhood shape how they act as an adult? Did they go to therapy? Did they not go to therapy? Are they in therapy? These are things that you need to know about how they're handling. Did they take their courses so that way they can diagnose themselves? Like, these are all things that you need to be aware of as you're creating your characters. So remember, Your characters are your nervous system of your book. They make your readers feel. So give them something to feel. Hilarious. I'm a jokester. I hope that was funny to you guys because I am laughing on the inside. But as I stated, because of a last minute travel schedule change that I was made aware of yesterday, I will not be here to be able to do this next week. So I'm giving you week 3 and 4 together. So moving into week 4, settings and world building. This is probably my favorite part of writing a book. I don't understand why. Actually, I do. I love creating a new world. I love creating the rules. I love everything that comes with world building and the setting because your plot is the bones. They hold you up. They keep you strong. They keep it sturdy. The characters are your nervous system. The setting and the world building, they're the skin, baby. They make you look pretty. But the setting sets the tone, sets where your books are. It allows people to sort of close their eyes and get immersive into the book and like, oh, I can feel the breeze or I can feel the coldness, the dankness. I feel uncomfortable because of this. Like, oh my gosh, I can see the zombies. Oh my gosh, I see the dragon. Oh, I feel the sun on the sand and the breeze from the air. That is your setting. That is your world. Is this like Hunger Games where you're just like, oh no, I'm good. You built such a good world. I never want to visit there. Or is it like Game of Thrones where it's, no one wins. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. Or is it like Harry Potter where it's like, you know what? I want to go to Hogwarts. I do. The setting and the world building, it gives your story the skin, the prettiness, the beautiful, all of that. It makes people like, oh my gosh, I would love to be there. But while it is my most fun part of writing, you gotta get it. You gotta do it correctly. So in this, what was that? In this week, we will be talking about. So in this section, we'll be talking about immersive settings, how settings influence plot, world building techniques, outlining your settings, and then going into homework and the Q&A. So let's get started. Immersive settings. Again, show, don't tell. Let your readers see exactly what the world is. Let them feel the air on their skin. Let them smell the beautiful croissants being baked at the market. Let them turn their nose at the smell of the fish, the smell of the zombies overtaking the world. Let them smell, let them feel the sun from the sand on the beach. Let them feel the heat from the dragon fire. Let them feel it. Show it. Don't tell them. Let them see it. Let them be able to close their eyes and see in their minds the world. You want someone to be able to read a chapter, a scene, a setting, and then to be able to draw it because, like, you know what? I could see it so clearly. That is what you want when you do settings and world building. You need to be specific because if you're especially if you're being in a real world, if you're being in a fantasy world and you're creating everything, you might have a little bit more leeway with being a little bit generalized. But for the most part, you want to be very specific. So that way everything sort of stays within the same realm. Everything stays even and equal. And then you want consistency. Because you don't want to say the world is a dark place filled with rain and clouds, thunder, and then in one scene she's standing on a tropical beach. Like, you want to be consistent. If you're saying all of the world is covered in this horrible snow, maybe there's not an oasis. Just be consistent on how your world is set up. How settings influence the plot. So, your settings can influence your plot because it can help push the stories, push your characters forward. So, for example, um, if your character is on a run from the guards because they attacked the castle and they need to get away, and they're running through a rocky, hilly, gravelly beach to get to their boat that's out at the rough rocks that's out at sea. That is action, that is struggle, that is something your characters have to get through. If they're running and huffing and jumping over rocks and they're climbing, she felt the scrape on her foot, but she knew she couldn't stop and inspect the wound because the knights were right behind her. Those are all things that push your plot forward, but also gives a little bit more oomph to your plot. If they're supposed to be on a rocky beach, but they are easily able to make it across, no issue, no problem, and they don't have they don't have the shoes or the right clothing on, that doesn't really make any sense. How did they get from point A to point B without any problems? I wrote a scene where one of my characters was running through a building on fire. So she felt the heat lick her skin as she was trying to wiggle her way down the hallway. She felt the singe on her skin, and that sort of like made her react and how she would open a door. She had to cover her mouth with her shirt because she couldn't breathe in the smoke. That setting added to the action and the plot of her trying to get to someone in a house that was burning down. It pushed the story forward and it added a little extra layer, an element of worry for the reader to be like, oh no, is she going to make it? These are things you want to think about when you're thinking of the setting and how it can influence different scenes within your plot. What is the culture and environment of of um of your setting? Now, this can go two ways. Now, if you're creating a book in a live city that exists, you sort of have your culture and your environment sort of figured out. So, Amatry's Magic takes place in Washington, D.C., but it takes place in parts of Washington, D.C. that you can't see unless you're magical. So, I had a little bit of leeway in how the culture and the environment was. But for the most part, I knew how everything was. Anytime that she was in the regular world, I knew exactly what the culture was like. I knew exactly what the environment was like. I knew exactly how other people would act, what the city would look like, what the rules were, um, what were the cultural norms, what was the weather like. I knew those things because I was putting the story basically mainly in a city that already existed in this world. For Adelathea, I had a lot more wiggle room because I created a whole new world for this one. It takes place in a modern time, but I created a whole new world for Adelathea. So their weather could have been whatever I wanted it to be. Their geography, whatever I wanted it to be. Their cultural norms, whatever I wanted it to be. I created the whole hierarchy and all of that because I created a world for that. So everything in it was up to my design. I didn't have to listen to any rules because I could make my own because this world didn't exist outside of this book. So physics, technically, I didn't have to listen to it. Let's make some magic. But for Lindell, it was half and half because there's part of it takes place on Earth. I never say what city or town it takes place in, but part of it takes place on Earth, and then the rest takes place in space and on different planets. And so I was able to have some wiggle room when she was off planet. But these are things you got to keep track of as you are world building. What is it? What is the world you're building, and what are the rules within it? And can your character survive within the world with the rules that you are creating, or the rules that already exist? And then going back up to settings influencing plot. Some examples of it is if you are writing like a dystopian type novel where the world has ended and people are trying to rebuild. So think of there was a TV show that was out where I can't remember the name of it, but like all the power stopped. Electricity stopped. And so people were like sort of went back to the time before electricity and they were rebuilding society in a sort of a dystopian world. that vastly changes how people would act if they were living on a tropical resort that never lost power. So just keep that in mind of the type of settings you can have. A book set in a time where electricity once existed and now no longer does, and everyone alive remembers when they lost electricity, um, is a very different than a book taking place on a sunny beach that has never known a day of problems in its entire life. So keep just keep that in mind when you're doing your plot. You may be like, oh, I would love for this book to take place on the beach. Is that going to further your story? Does that make sense if your story is all about heartache and strife? Just saying. Now going back after the culture and the environment, what is the mood and the atmosphere of your book? Because if you're trying to write a very serious drama, maybe your plot needs to reflect that. Or if you're doing a happy-go-lucky story of a girl finding love in the modern time, maybe you don't write it in the zombie apocalypse dystopian type setting. So just make sure your setting makes sense for your book. And if it doesn't, maybe that just means you have a second or third book in your hand. Going in to world building techniques. There's so many. There's so many. Now, before we get into how you can build your world, let's talk about being consistent. This goes back to how I said earlier that if you said your world only it rains every day, there's no green, there's no sunniness, there's no sand, there's no beach, it's just heavy rains, rocky soil, like clouds all the time, then maybe a scene doesn't take place at a tropical resort. Your world needs to be consistent. And then if you want to hold to a fantasy world or a sci-fi world or a historical fiction, that needs to be consistent too. If you're writing a truly historical fiction that has nothing to do with time travel, no one's picking up a cell phone. Like, no one has phones. Make sure you're being consistent to the time. If you are writing a fantasy, pure fantasy, with like high elves and no one's ever heard of electricity, and sci-fi, science fiction doesn't exist, everything that is talked about in that book needs to be consistent. And same with sci-fi. So you just want to make sure your world is consistent throughout the story. And then map your world. So for those of you like me who can't draw, there's a wonderful tool called Wonder Draft that I use to help sort of figure out how I want my world to look. It's like a world generator, and it sort of allows you to build your own little world or town if you're a visual person. Sometimes, like if you Google world generator, fantasy map generator, all these types of generators, they come up where you can find an example of what you would like your fictional world to look like. Now, if you were doing something off of a real world and you wanted to be in a real world space, you need to look up a map. You need to look up a map for the area that your story is taking place. Because if you're using real places, do not be like people on TV shows and like, hey, you said you're in DC, but none of what you just said is in DC. And if this is supposed to be in a real city and they're not saying there's any type of like fantasy or any sci-fi element that sort of could explain it away, like if you're doing a real city, you need to make sure you're doing the real city justice. This is coming as someone who hates seeing her city on TV because they never do it correctly. It's like, that doesn't exist there. That's not what that metro station looks like at all. Our metro station does not look like that. Talking to you, Bones. And so it's very interesting to see how some people like don't do their research about what a city will look like if they're making it the main point of their story. So when I wrote Ametry's Magic, I didn't live in DC. I worked in DC every day. And so I walked the routes that Olivia walked. So I know they're walkable because I've walked them before. Is it a long walk? Is it a annoying walk for some of it? Yes. But I know everything that she did in that book travel wise that she had to do physical travel for was the time it took to do that because I've done that walk before. I've had to do it. So I know Okay, that brings a little bit more truth to your story for your readers. So map it. Know exactly what you're doing and where you're sending people, and does that make sense? Research it. Now, if you don't know it, learn it. There's so many books out there about history, about physics, about science fiction, about fantasy, about magic. And if you want to use something that already exists, I stress this by saying, if you want to use something that already exists, you have to know what you're talking about. Now, in both my magic elements, I created because I wanted my own magical system, because I wanted something slightly different and free-formed. And I didn't see any magical systems that worked for me. So I created my own magical system because I wanted to have full control over the rules of it. I wanted to make sure that what they were doing was something that could be done, and I was not breaking someone else's rules, you know? So I did the research into different magic systems. I wasn't really a fan of them for these stories in particular. So make sure you research it if you want to use something that exists, because you want to make sure that you are doing justice to what already is out there. And if you didn't own it, you got to make sure you respect it. And then know the language, customs, and history. If you're doing a story that takes place in another country that you've never stepped foot on, you need to know what's going on in that country. You need to know how they would react to stuff. You need to understand what the history of that country is, or those customs of the city, of the state, of wherever you're creating it. If you are putting it in a spot that already exists, you need to learn the languages, the custom, the history. If you are creating your own space, same thing. You need to know the language, the customs, and the history, because it's going to come up. At some point, it may be one little line, two little lines, and you can do all this backstory and world building, and none of it will ever see the light of day, but it helps you shape the story in a more believable format. So no matter what, language, customs, and history. And if you're using a real world place, research it, map it, and be consistent. Hopefully I'm not scaring you guys off. So, outlining your setting. This sort of leads into your homework for week 4. So some questions you can always ask yourself is, where is the story set? What is the time period? Are there any key locations? What is the culture like? And does your setting affect your characters? Or just remember, your setting affects your characters. When outlining your settings, make sure you remember those 5 questions, because it will make sure that you're not just building a set for something that's never going to see the light of day. I mean, I still do, because it's fun to have, like, there are so many places in Amatry's magic that exist and only in my mind and on my notebook that never made it to the final paper, never made it to the final print. But it still helped me create a more well-rounded story. In Elendil, there are so many more scenes. Even in Amatry's magic, there's so many different settings that never technically made it into the book, but it exists. There's places that exist. So keep that in mind. So if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on my Instagram, Andrea Rose Washington for most things, or Andrea Rose W. Hit me up with a question, let me know. And your homework for this week, is to complete a detailed setting outline. And you want to write a scene featuring a setting in your book. So the opening line of Amatry's magic is like, the cool breeze blew in. Oh my God, did I just forget my first line? But the first line in Amatry's magic is about the setting. Is about Sasha loving the view of her farm and seeing everything and just being happy to be on her family's farm. It was about the setting. It set the tone sort of for the start of the book. And it's like, the cool breeze blew in. That's like the first line of Adelathea. So write a scene that's featuring a setting in your book and complete a detailed setting outline. Because if you've noticed, you would have written a 1-page summary. You would have worked on your plot outline. you would have worked on your character outline, and now you're working on your setting outline. With those 4 things combined, you can then start merging them together to build one main plot, one main outline, because these all build upon each other. Your plot was the bones. Your plot was the bones, the structure. It held up the story. It got you from point A to point B. It was the framework. The characters are your nervous system, the wiring. They make you feel something. They make you come alive. And the world building, I like to call it the skin. It's what makes it pretty. It's what makes people go, that was so pretty. That's so beautiful. I can just see it. And that's what you want. So we are, if I know how to work this, have just completed week 3 and week 4 of this 12-week course. And next week we will be going, and not next week, I apologize, October 1st, I believe. Tuesday, October 1st. We'll be going into point of view and your voice. I don't know why I said it like that. Your point of view and your voice. So you have 2 weeks to, if you didn't finish your outline, to finish your plot outline, to work on your character outline, and work on your settings and world building outline. And a tip for your character outline, write your storyline for each character. What do they go through? And that sort of helps you then pull stuff from each character and put it into one big outline as well. If you know all the things a character is going to go through, write their name on the list at the top of the page and just start jotting down everything they're going to go through and what is their arc and all those things. And those will help you build your character outline. So I hope you all enjoyed this whenever you watch it. For those who stopped in and joined me tonight, thank you. If you didn't have any questions here, you can ask me questions later. But I want to thank you all for joining me, because I sort of wish I had this when I started writing. And because people ask me at every convention, I now can say I have a playlist on some social media platform so people can go through and write their stories, because your story needs to be told and I want to help you tell them. So, as always, I'm Andrea, and thank you for joining me.